Marie, this brings up an interesting point. You had said, I think you were cut off just briefly, but you had talked about transparency on behalf of the White House, sharing information that normally we usually would keep much more guarded about, basically, speaking to what moves Putin is making and essentially in many ways forcing his hand. Historically, we usually tend to keep that far more top secret. When we consider that, and then there was a recent story about Russians not having access to electronic payments through Apple, Google, and such, and basically paying out of cash, for services such as mass transportation or even trying to access Netflix and stuff like that. I bring up those two important data points to talk about the nature of conflict globally in the 21st century, and our response at the White House, but then also what basically Europe and the rest of the world is immediately countered economically against Russia. With those two things in mind, Marie, what does that speak to in terms of the way maybe our global reaction is to conflict, and how is that maybe different than what we may have seen back in 2013 or even previously?
Yeah, there are some people on Twitter, which I try and stay off of, but
good idea.
Sometimes I lurk, who claim this is like the first conflict that's played out on social media, which is not true. They have seemed to miss Syria or
Brown people countries. You can say
it. Right. Like suddenly they care because they're Europeans. Fine. We can just all say that. But so I do think that you asked, someone mentioned misinformation and disinformation earlier. Look, I think that we have seen one of the big challenges for people that have the jobs like I had is how you counter that. And I actually think the Ukrainians, and I think, Mike, you mentioned, like, there's some weird numbers on both sides here, but I think that what we may be seeing is that Putin and his top people have started believing their own propaganda. And there was one of the Russian websites had a story written ready to go about how they had conquered Ukraine, and they accidentally posted it early and then it got taken down. I think it is very dangerous when you start believing your own BS, right? And it kind of seems, it's puzzling to me that they did not prepare the Russian military beneath the generals and folks there for what was coming. And I'm not sure Putin actually knew what was coming. I'm not sure how good the information is that he's getting, but that's what's hard to counter, right? I think what's been fascinating is that the world is so clearly seeing what's happening. Russian propaganda isn't working as well. When we had the shoot down of MH17, when we had, the little green men in the Donbass, like, most people didn't believe it, but we didn't have a UN General Assembly vote where only 5 countries, 4 other countries voted with Russia. So I think it's almost like the Russian propaganda has gone too far, and that our government is calling it out and doing it in a way they hadn't before. We didn't do this in 2014 and 15. I think we thought that, like, what mattered if a bunch of people lied on Twitter? And then we all had the presidential election of 2016. We were like, oh, maybe it does matter what people say on Facebook. Maybe this propaganda effort is real. And this Russian, in the Russian invasion and everything that's gone with it should be seen as part of a bigger policy, as Jared mentioned. But that policy includes what they did in 2016 here, and they're meddling in our, they are fighting an information war against the West. This is part of it. This is all part of the same grand strategy, I would argue, that Putin has been pursuing. And so I think that, we have rallied the world. I don't know how much, and maybe Jared knows more about what the Russian people themselves actually see of this, what they actually hear, what they actually know. I know 2 things. I know that when body bags start coming back of young Russians to their mothers, that will not be very good. And that when Russians can't use Apple Pay, can't leave the country, can't fly on an airplane, that will not be good. I also know that autocrats who are willing to put down their people, challenges violently, tend to survive. And Putin is certainly one of them. So all these people who say, well, maybe this is the end of Putin, these guys tend to hang on. Look at Assad. The list is countless, right? So yeah. It's a tough time right now to be fighting this information war.
And I want to ask both of you this, because before you both hopped on in the previous segment, we shouted out a couple of reporters across the media sphere. You obviously know Nick and I are both journalism grads, and I started once upon a time in news, and Nick did local radio as well. And we are big on shouting out the folks that are doing this the right way. I've mentioned Trey Yingst at Fox News, Tim Mack at NPR, obviously Clarissa Ward and Matthew Chance at CNN, and all the great work they're doing. But there was a couple of reporters from CBS News and NBC News specifically that recently got entangled words-wise, losing the ability to articulate why this conflict was different, and some equating it that we've never seen white people as refugees like this, or right, and making this racial undertone type of statement on television to their television networks. I wanted to ask both of you, Jared, I'll start with you first, because you're teaching kids right now potentially about media literacy. You and I went to high school together, and I remember our history teacher talking about media literacy and how to actually interpret a series of facts across articles. What are you teaching students about this conflict? Because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there available. And I just mentioned at the top of the program, the disparity in the numbers reported of civilian deaths, Russian military troop deaths. So what are you teaching your class about media literacy? And then, Marie, I want to get to you about how to actually do that, because you are on the television docket. So, but Jared, I turn to you first.
Yeah, sure. So I'm certainly not an expert in media literacy, but what I could make a connection to is the way in which I teach research skills. Because ultimately, when you're going online, whether you're reading Fox or CNN or Vox or Politico, what I try to teach my students overall is try to get articles and information from as many different places as possible, and then compare that information, in real time. That to me is really one of the best ways to kind of get a clear picture of things. I also try to tell students, because again, in the world that we live in, we're so polarized, especially in terms of the kinds of news that we watch. I actually do stress to the kids, go and find the thing that you are most opposed to and read those articles, So if you despise Fox or despise CNN, try to go, and read what those reporters are saying. That's kind of, how, I personally sort of try to combat it. We also have some media classes here at school. Those classes are actually taught by our department head. And again, they do a lot of the kind of work that you're referring to. So that's pretty much my kind of take on it.
Marie, to you, because as somebody that was once at a pulpit controlling information, you've seen what happened with the Biden administration. I see John Kirby all the time up at the Pentagon, giving different speeches and statements. Jen Psaki and everybody's trying to control the information of what the U.S. is doing, the intel that they're getting. And specifically, I thought about this because the Biden administration with what happened in Afghanistan, the intel that they were getting about how fast Kabul would fall was way off, or at least perceived to be way off. Whereas here, they've been pretty spot on if you go back and trace the different intel and the warning signs that the Biden administration, communication-wise from the State Department on, have all been on the same page about this is imminent. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. So what do you think about the way the communication system has been handled here, not only domestically, but what you're seeing internationally and the reporting from the outlets?
Well, I totally agree about these reporters. I would put in there Jill Dougherty. She was CNN's bureau chief a while ago, retired from CNN. It works at Georgetown now, and has been reporting like all day, all night from Moscow for CNN again. These reporters have been amazing, and I think do us such a service. So I think that's extraordinary. I would also say, this may be the former CIA officer in me, I'm always very wary of the narrative that it was an intel failure, because it's a very easy thing to say when you make a policy decision that doesn't go right. I'm not saying Afghanistan was or wasn't. I don't know. I don't have intelligence access anymore. But I think that's when I was at the State Department podium, I was very aware of that fact, that it's very easy to whisper to a reporter, well, the intel wasn't that good, when maybe we just made a policy decision or we didn't plan enough or whatever. But look, I will say on this conflict, there has been enormous cohesion and proactive messaging coming from the administration. I cannot underscore how extraordinary it is that they are basically putting out intel in real time, and that they are saying, this is what we're doing and this is why. And, John Kirby, Ned Price, and Jen Psaki are all pros. They know what they're doing. But the other thing you have to do at the State Department, and this is a crucial point, is always leave room for diplomacy and always leave room for an off ramp. Putin needs, I don't know if I want to say off ramp, that may not be the right word. There needs to be a way out of this. And so you cannot do anything at that podium that limits those options unnecessarily, unless that's a tactic, right? This is, you have several audiences at the podium. Obviously, you put out information to the public, to the American people, to people around the world. You also send signals to foreign governments, right? And you have to leave room or give signals about what that might look like, because we have to give them space to come back from the brink or put pressure on at the right time. But that has to be a key part of this as well. I really believe that.
Marie and Jared, I'm going to direct you both, and Mike to drink along with the ride. Another actor
expert.
There it is. And that's the important thing. Like, neither of us are. But I want to bring another actor onto the stage in this conversation. That's China. Jared, you mentioned them earlier. And prior to you both coming on, it's something I had talked about too. It felt as though China has been a little like the Homer Simpson meme, where you kind of come out of the bush and then kind of recede back. In the fact that Putin just again, from outsider's perspective, that the global reaction to the invasion of Ukraine didn't land the way he imagined. And I wonder specifically out of Beijing, is there been a reticence that perhaps, again, speculation, obviously, that maybe Putin assumed more support would have come from China, and that's become muted all of a sudden for one reason or the other? And Jared, just from a historical perspective, I want to ask you to sort of share on that. And then Marie, just from obviously your background in the State Department, is there any reality to this assertion that a journalism major from Rutgers University who co-hosts the podcast happens to be openly asking? Jared, to you first.
Yeah, sure. So, the funny thing about the relationship between Russia and China is I think that most people often assume that they have this wonderful relationship, right? They've traditionally had a very tenuous relationship in many, many different regards. So, for example, if you look at some of the things that the Chinese are saying right now, or the Chinese government more specifically is saying, is look, on one hand, they're not even acknowledging the invasion, right? They're not necessarily even coming out and using that word, right? Because they want to, again, sort of stay buddy-buddy with the Russians, right? But at the same time, they are absolutely condemning all of the different, tactics that the Russians have been using, especially recently, like even in the last few hours, with the Russians targeting specifically civilians in many of their attacks, which I can almost guarantee you're going to start to see more of in the next few days. So again, you guys use the word speculation. I'll speculate as well. Look, we've always known that the Chinese have had interests in Taiwan and reclaiming Taiwan. We know that they've always had interests in putting more pressure on Hong Kong. My best guess as a historian is the Chinese are going to wait to see how this sort of plays out, right? And in a lot of ways, the Russians did the same thing. Though I don't know. I'd be curious, Marie, to hear what your thoughts are, because again, I'm a layman, I'm a teacher, you worked for the government, but to me, look, there has to be a correlation, or at least it seems there's a correlation between the fact that if you look back at 2014, is it really that much of a surprise that, and again, I'm not saying we should have got more involved in Syria, but we clearly did not go after Assad necessarily in the way that we claimed we would, if he, broke certain rules and crossed the quote unquote red line. And to me, it's not necessarily a surprise that almost immediately after the Crimea is annexed. And again, same thing here, where whether it was the right or wrong move, the United States pulling out of Afghanistan and everything happening in Kabul, again, is it that much of a coincidence that the Russians then decided to move, against the Ukraine itself? And then again, even earlier, we brought up the fact that the Russians came after us in 2016 and meddled with our election. They clearly would rather have had Donald Trump in office than Hillary Clinton, right? So to me, it's a correlation. But again, this is speculation. So Marie, I think you would probably be the best person to kind of build on these points.
Well, thank you. I feel like I have a large bar to live up to now.
No pressure.
No pressure, right? So I think a couple of things. I think first, we in the United States often think that other countries do or don't do things because of what we do or don't do. And I think that's true to some extent, but I think Putin had been planning something like this for quite some time. And so something like Kabul and Afghanistan, like probably influenced him, but like, I think this has been his goal all along. But I think more broadly, well, also side point, we should have done more in Syria, and we should have done it in like 2011 and 2012. I think by the time we got to the second term of the Obama years, when I was in the State Department, it was much more difficult. That's a whole other segment or, show you could do. But when it comes to China, I think that the key difference here is that China, I think, again, speculation, believes that the international system as it's set up now is to its benefit to be a part of that, right? Economically, diplomatically, I think it believes that it can continue rising and prospering within the international system as it stands now. Whereas Putin is like giving the finger to the international system, right? And so I actually think China, hopefully, I don't know, hopefully if I should say that, I think China probably looks at this and is like, we're not like those bad guys, we're not those thugs and we're part of the system. We are part of it. We want to be good citizens. Now we can all debate the Uyghurs. We can't actually debate the Uyghurs. There are all these things we can name that make them not the good guys, certainly. But if China takes a lesson from this, I think they will also see that it took something so egregious to get this reaction from the world, and that there's a lot of things short of this, some of which they've already done when it comes to Taiwan or Hong Kong, that they can continue to do to exert their influence that would not get this response. And I think that's probably a lesson they're learning as well. So if that keeps them from doing some of this more egregious things, then okay. But I think they see themselves as having a leadership role in the New World Order, whereas Russia hates the New World Order, right? They want to get rid of it. And that's, I think we will see. There's also countries like India. I mean, why India, the UAE, they're weird. Israel has a relationship with Russia. There are countries we need to hear from, some of whom we haven't heard enough from, I would say, yet.
We recently had award-winning journalist Amy McKinnon from Foreign Policy on the program. This was 3 weeks ago, and she was about to travel to the region, to Kyiv specifically. And I asked her, when you come back in a couple of weeks, what will the media coverage look like? What will be unfolding within the region? This was at the time when Russia was amassing troops. And she said, one of the things about Vladimir Putin is he's not 10 feet tall and nobody knows what he's going to do. But I fear for my friends and colleagues that are working in the region, because I do feel that there will be an invasion and that will be part of the coverage. I turn to both of you as people listen to this in perpetuity down the line, whether they're listening to it tomorrow or a year from now. How does this all end? Because unfortunately, here in the States, I think we love finality, right? I'm still mad about the Sopranos finale. Everybody is. And I think
I was fine with it. You got to let it go, Mike.
Well, we can argue about that offline. But I think about something like that. There's no putting this genie back in the bottle, right? So how does this all shake out? Jared, I want to turn to you first because you're teaching history, right? Does this end in a diplomatic solution? We've talked about at the top of the program and so far in this conversation about peace talks, I'm using air quotes, in Belarus between Ukrainian officials and Russian officials. Does it end with a surrender and Russia controlling more of Ukraine? And what does that look like now that they've sent bombs to residential areas in Kharkiv and Kyiv specifically? So to both of you, Jared, you first, where do you see this finally ending up? What does this look like months from now?
Well, it's pretty hard to predict. That said, it's going to be very difficult, I should say, for the Ukrainians to hold their cities. Over the next couple of weeks, the thing you have to remember about the Russian military, I've been comparing the Russian military to a sledgehammer, whereas the US military is more of a scalpel. The thing is, though, the Russian military is trying to act like a scalpel. That's why they're not doing particularly well right now. They're not good at the things that they're trying to do. So if I had to make a guess, they're going to resort to the things that typically the Russian military has always sort of resorted to: brute force. The second that western border is closed, or the second that weapons aren't coming into the country anymore, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to keep the Russian military out of these cities. Now, again, looking at wars over the last 20 or 30 years, I mean, anything could happen. There could certainly be an insurgency in the Ukraine, which would be a very bad thing for a lot of people, but specifically for the Russian military. We learned that lesson in Iraq. We learned that lesson in Afghanistan. Here's another thing to consider, and I'm glad you asked this question, Mike, because I want to circle back to the idea of propaganda. And you had said earlier, or you had asked, how is the Russian populace sort of handling this? There are enormous protests going on in Russia right now. I've looked at a few different polls. There are some polls that say 50 to 60% of Russian people want nothing to do with this war. And I think somewhere around 6,000 people have already been arrested. The thing about war since Vietnam, it doesn't matter if you're a democracy. It doesn't matter if you're an authoritarian state. Vladimir Putin needs the populace on his side. The more protests that there are, the longer that this war goes on, the longer that those sanctions start to impact the pockets of all his buddies, all of that will spell difficulties for the Russian state to move forward. So even if the Ukraine falls, if all of that dissent continues, right, in Russia domestically, Putin is going to have a very big decision to make, right? I guess I'll phrase it as a question. I mean, is he bold enough to actually attack a place like Poland? Is he bold enough to actually attack Romania or again, any nation in which there will be an escalation of the conflict, right? I would hope that he's not bold enough. I would assume that what Putin would do is he would start to put pressure on some of those countries in the same way that he put pressure on us in 2016. Those are really a lot of my best guesses in terms of where we're headed. And look, ultimately, this is something that I've been telling my students, and I would hope I can get across to viewers. I mean, we want peace, obviously, right? I mean, the way in which we're talking about this, God only knows what it's like to be a Ukrainian citizen in any one of those cities right now, right? I mean, you have everyday people picking up guns to try to defend their cities. So look, I'm pretty cynical when it comes to these quote unquote peace overtures. I mean, in reality, there's probably just stalling time so that the Russians could get reinforcements and resupplies into the country. But, we all have to sort of cross our fingers and you know what, maybe not be that superstitious, like rely on diplomacy, right? War is a tool, right, that states use. And let's not kid ourselves, right? We in the United States have done this as well, right? So, I mean, if you go all the way back, to 2003, Dick Cheney and company, blacking out documents, making all sorts of claims about the Iraqi government being connected to Al-Qaeda. None of this is new. So to me, what it comes down to is diplomacy. And I'm hoping that diplomacy will prevail in the end. And if not, maybe, whether it's the United States or the EU, might have to take a firmer stance against Vladimir Putin, maybe more firm than that's being taken now.
Marie?
I do agree that it's hard to predict, but there are a few things I think I feel confident-ish saying. First, I think that Europe is more unified than they may have been than they certainly have been in decades. That we have seen a post-World War II, post-Cold War architecture, post-9/11, right? All of the posts. Europe has come into its own during this conflict. You have countries like Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, Germany, making huge cataclysmic, did I say that right? Cataclysmic, huge cataclysmic
you got it.
Policy shifts in the matter of days. right? There are decades where it feels like nothing big in the world happens, and then it feels like the world changes overnight. That's the period of time we're living through. So I think Europe has changed fundamentally. I think Ukraine has been pushed even further towards Europe. I mean, they're trying to get into the EU. We don't know if they'll be able to, but any question about whether Ukraine wanted to be free and sovereign and part of the West, I think has been answered. And the thing that Putin wanted to get rid of, Ukrainian nationalism, he only managed to make burn so brightly, right? I mean, he has done more than maybe anyone to ignite the sense of nationalism in the Ukrainian people. And I think that does not go away. He cannot extinguish that. In fact, he's done the opposite. I think those things are true. I think that the Russian military can undertake a really brutal slog of violence through Ukraine. And I think they will be met for however long they continue to do that with an insurgency. And, we certainly fought an insurgency and saw that you can't really win. Russia has too, many times. Those aren't winnable military conflicts. So I think those are things I feel fairly confident saying. The question I have is what Putin really wants and will accept. It was always a fig leaf to promise no NATO. That was not what Putin, right? That's not what he wanted. And I obviously agree about the power of diplomacy. Diplomacy backed up by a whole lot of force, economic, military, diplomatic. We are finally hitting Putin, I think, where it really, really, really hurts. And this promise of the fall of the Soviet Union, which was very quickly proven, was not going to be this democratic blossoming and economic opening that we thought in what then became Russia. It feels like I also feel fairly confident saying that as long as Vladimir Putin is in power, Russian people, the Russian economy will not come anywhere close to meeting their full potential. It will be a country stagnant, worse than stagnant. And I think for the Russian people, that is, the latest in a very long line of tragedies that have befallen them. And that I also feel fairly confident saying. And the open question is what Putin will take. I think the Ukrainians will, and the West and the world will exact costs on him. And whether there is anyone close to him that can tell him this, whether there are generals, whether there are oligarchs, whether there are people who can say, you have to pull back and you have to do it. You will do it in a way that you can spin to whoever you need to spin it to. Those are the unknown questions that will determine a lot of these outcomes here. I think it's smart of the Ukrainians to go to the negotiating table. I think it's smart of them to be there. I think the first step has to be some sort of ceasefire, cessation of hostilities. I don't even know if we can get that. So that's sitting here today, at the beginning of, early March. That's what I feel confident saying right now.
Well, listen, yeah, go ahead, Jack.
I just one more point, because I've just been thinking about this, as we've been talking. I just wanted to highlight the importance of information. We've all brought it up in different ways. One of the things that Vladimir Putin is a master of is he's a master of taking kernels of truth and exaggerating it in order to justify his reasoning for doing things. So if you look at what's happening in Ukraine right now, what he's done is he's taken things from Russian history. So, for example, the fear of the West, the fear of not having a buffer zone between France and Germany and, the Russian state. So like playing on fears that Russian people have. All of these neo-Nazi claims, which date back to World War II, right? When many Ukrainians, because of what Joseph Stalin had done to them, basically supported, the Germans. What Putin does is he takes those things and exaggerates them to the point of being complete and total lies, right? So information is going to be so important in terms of everything that we're talking about right now. That's why it's a really brilliant move what the US government is doing, right? Every time he comes up with these reasonings. So for example, if he takes the Ukraine and he starts making up all these lies about Poland, let's say, or Romania, or whatever country he decides to sort of zero in on, the more that we can disprove those things, the more, hopefully, Russian people will be able to access that information, continue to protest the way that they've been doing. And again, just to draw a parallel, look at the Vietnam War, look at the Iraq War. Whether you agreed with those conflicts or not, regular people can have a lot of power if they open their mouths and speak truth. So I just wanted to make sure I got that point in.